Sitaram, Assalamu Alaikum, Namaste and good evening and welcome to Bhoolal Parampara, Forgotten Traditions. Today we look at a very interesting ritual or tradition that has went through a lot because of changing time. So it fits well into Forgotten Traditions. It is the anti-Ishti sanskar of the Hindus within Trinidad and Tobago and more so the Southern Caribbean. As we all know, during colonial times, cremation wasn't the more popular way to do the anti-Ishti sanskar because it was outlawed and burial was more common. Even though we talk about it, we learn about it, not in the past, a lot of research hasn't been done into these mortuary traditions of the Indo-Caribbean sect. So today I have with me Dr. Keith McNeal, Associate Professor of Anthropology in the Department of Comparative Cultural Studies at the University of Houston. And his research is very interesting. He has done a lot of research in the culture or cultural traditions within the Southern Caribbean for a really long time, for decades, I think. He will clarify that. He was a Fulbright scholar affiliated with the department, with the Institute of Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies, where I think a lot of his research was done in Trinidad. And there are two books in front of me. One was written by him, Trans and Modernity in the Southern Caribbean. It looked at African and Hindu popular religions in Trinidad and Tobago. And recently, the book Passage and the Afterworlds, Anthropological Perspectives of Death in the Caribbean, was published in 2018. And one of his articles there, or one of the chapters, was done by him based on the research I spoke of, Death and the Problem of Orthopraxy in Caribbean Hinduism. Welcome, Keith. This is a very significant piece of research from my perspective, because a lot of times we talk about it in Trinidad, about the fact in the past burials were done, and then after it was it was no longer against the law, then all of a sudden cremation started to become in vogue. But your research is very interesting because it looks at the political, the sociological, and anthropological reasons, at least for over the last 150 years. But you could just give us a little brief of the highlights or things you would have found in the research?
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Well, actually, many people are surprised to hear that Indians, and specifically Hindus in particular, haven't been cremating the dead this whole time, in terms of the entire history of being in the Caribbean. I guess maybe you mentioned knowing about it, but many people are surprised to hear that. So I set about to reconstruct the history of Indo-Trinidadian and specifically Hindu mortuary ritual. And what I found was there were a number of interesting sort of surprises or revelations that emerged in the course of the research. I found that Indians during the early colonial period under indentureship essentially buried their dead across the board. There is no evidence. I haven't been able to find any evidence that suggests otherwise. Of course, we don't know for sure definitively whether, maybe someone was cremated along the way. But in any case, the historical record, the sources that we have don't indicate that there was any cremation whatsoever. I also surveyed early 20th century newspaper articles, the Port of Spain Gazette, for example, over a period of decades, and I sampled some articles which describe funerary processions and burials in which there seems to be at least some degree of enthusiasm for burial, and there's no sign, at least from the standpoint of newspaper reporter observers, which is not a perfect source, obviously, right. But there's no sign of any discontent with burial, which was interesting too. Then in the late 30s and throughout the 1940s, there was a sort of small vanguard of Hindu activists who were really starting to agitate for the right to cremate. That was also the time that there was sort of an expanding effort to agitate for the recognition of Hindu marriages and Muslim marriages, for example, non-Christian schools, so on and so forth. So the right to cremate was part of that effort. And it was about a 15-year kind of political fight that I can speak about if you want at some point, because it's very interesting,
Sure.
but it culminates in 1953 with the formal legalization of cremation. It, in fact, is, to be precise, cremation was never actually outlawed in the colony. There's no evidence of that, and the Hansard transcript from 1953, which is what I also looked at, in the commentary, the various politicians and members of the Legislative Council basically acknowledge that it was never officially formally outlawed or criminal, but for all intents and purposes, it was basically proscribed. It was not accepted. It was looked down upon by the colonial establishment.
So it more as a social norm, as opposed to
but I mean,
legislative.
and also, I mean, I think that the sort of weight, the sort of intimidation of the colonial government, it was very difficult to, I mean, how would your everyday person just go up and sort of ask to cremate, when it wasn't done, there was no tradition of it, and they knew that it was looked down upon. And
based on the research, you said that it seemed to be quite prevalent, and there were no objections by Hindus prior to this movement that you spoke of in the 1940s and 50s. But just going back into that, I think to bring it into some sort of context, to the broader perspective of Indo-European, because that's where Hinduism comes from, that school of philosophy and religion. Cremation is not within those civilizations the only way of the final rites for someone, is it?
I believe so. I should also add that cremation is not, I mean, there are 5 recognized scriptural options in the sort of Vedic and Sanskrit-based Hindu traditions. Burial is one. Actually, cremation is one, obviously. Burial, there is several others. One has to do with water, and then also the practice of Parsis or Zoroastrians, where you leave the corpse to be devoured by essentially vultures. That's also recognized in Hindu scriptural tradition. So I think it's important to convey that the fact that Hindus buried their dead for the better part of the Indian experience in the Caribbean, that's an entirely acceptable and scripturally,
and that's the point,
important tradition in and of itself. It's just that cremation is considered the most theologically important because it's the most efficacious way of encouraging the deceased spirit to move onward toward its eventual rebirth.
But that's an important thing, because I read further on in that chapter, you were speaking about it was not a manifestation of Hinduism, Hindu identity, and Indianness within the space. So it represented that sort of revolution. But there are misunderstandings about the scriptures, because you just made the point there. I am sure that the average Hindu in Trinidad would know that in the scriptures there are different ways apart from cremation itself. So that it makes sense now that it would be perfectly acceptable to adapt to doing burials. But now, even though there were 5 different prescribed ways, obviously based on the society, the politics, as in this circumstance, prior to this, there would have also been different, at least from the 5, it would change as to what would the Antishi Sanskar would have composed of. So during the time of indentureship, which would have been 1845 to 1917 in Trinidad, in your research you looked at from those indentured laborers or coming from India, was there, or what was the common practice then prior to arriving in Trinidad, the mortuary ritual or the Antishi Sanskar?
That I can't say. Okay. I mean, I don't, we don't have records on that. I mean, we know something about indentureship, and there's a pretty impressive sort of body of historical research on the indentureship experience, but we don't I don't think we have very good knowledge. We don't have sources for and therefore knowledge about the specific people who came. But one would assume, I think plausibly, that people were cremating because that was.
But I think
and burying and doing, depending on the region that they come from, it depends. If they. Yeah, I think it depends on
why I asked the question, because looking now at parallel from my language research, a lot of times I find that we would assume that the vocabulary used in the modern language in India is the same that is here, but what I realized in doing the research is that a different source of vocabulary was used during the apprenticeship period. So again, applying that to this, then even though the common narrative, and for want of a better word, the Indian nationalistic movement, which is now something in Trinidad that encompasses that identity, and that pushes for cremation, then the average Trinidadian will think, well, then that's what it should be. Because when I looked at the language, when they bought Awadhi, Braj and Bhojpuri, they thought that was what came from India, but when they look back now, Khariboli became the standard, and they were like, maybe what we're doing is wrong. So I could see how that could be also there. So the research is very valid in the sense that maybe it was not cremation, a mixture of cremation, burial, and other forms of Antyeshti Sanskar. But you also brought up the interesting point about it was not stated in the legislation that it was outlawed to bury. Other factors, sociologically or anthropologically, you could look at that could have contributed to the fact that this would have been the more popular way of disposing of the dead.
You're getting at the question of why did people bury across the board?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's pretty clear that let's be clear that these were, these are subjugated folks. They weren't free. They were brought as colonial, conscripted labor subjects working on plantations. They didn't have freedom, and it was essentially a Christian colonial society in which cremation was looked down upon. Hinduism was looked down upon. So cremation is kind of like the ultimate sort of spectacular version of doing something Hindu, right? It's like the most different from how Christians dealt with their dead, right? So it was sort of like an extra scandalous kind of practice, right?
And it was out of the social norm then. So that it would actually be seen as a form of revolution, which we spoke about when we come up to the 1940s and 50s. Now,
but it also accounts for the fact that there was a plurality of acceptable modes of corpse disposal in South Asia, traditionally speaking.
Yeah.
That it also accounts for why, shifting to and sort of as a group focusing on burial and engaging in that form of corpse disposal would have been acceptable and not morally or theologically problematic, despite the fact that it was also sort of the result of compulsion as subjugated colonial subjects.
So seeing that it was cremation wasn't the only form prescribed, then it would have been easily adaptable to this social norm when they had come to Trinidad. Now, when the East Indian entered laborers did come to Trinidad, they met other ethnicities, other practices, other religions, basically, whether it be the Christianity of the colonial masters or, Anglicanism, because it was the British at that time, and then meeting the African slaves and the different things that would be practiced among that sector of the population. How did that influence or contributed to being part of the mainstream? Like, what was the mortuary rituals practiced in those different proportions or sects of the population?
Right. Well, interestingly, we have two important anthropological studies from the mid-1950s of specifically focused on Indo-Trinidadian communities, including Hinduism, but not just Hindus. The Nihofs were in the southwest Oropouche Lagoon area of Trinidad, and they have a book that they wrote. I can't remember the title now, but and then the Morton and the classes did a similarly oriented study at the same time in Felicity in central Trinidad, and both of them report that Indians in both locations, so we're talking about the mid-1950s, right? So that's reflecting, sort of traditions of practice, at least, moving into that time for a decade or two at least, right? So what they report is that Indian communities, including Hindus in both of those contexts, had adopted waking traditions from their Creole neighbors, and that waking had become sort of incorporated as part of the post-mortem ritual process. And also that Indians had also become very active in All Souls Day observances, going to the cemeteries annually at the beginning of November, cleaning the graves, and beautifying the graves and honoring the dead in that sense. But they would, often use diyas as opposed to candles.
Yes.
I mean, they would use candles too, but diyas, so you could tell that it was an Indian grave if there was the use of a diya, for example. So there was, I guess you could call creolization in that sense. That was being incorporated into Indo-Trinidadian mortuary ritual practice.
But that's very interesting, though, because a lot of times, and the narrative within the education system teaches these rituals of the Hindus as separate from the rest of the population. When we would look at, for instance, me growing up as Hindu, when somebody passed on, you had the Shrad, which would have been the shaving and the Bhandara. And then, but you'd have a waking period. But the waking period would obviously be with reading of the Ramcharitramanas and all that. But when you would look, I remember looking at the French Creole, for instance, their traditions. They also had, I think, certain folk songs that they would sing and lighten up flambeaux during the weekend period. So I think it's not well meshed even in our history books that what is practiced among Hindus in the now manifested form of what Andeshi Sanskar is, it did imbibe a lot from the environment much around. And my personal opinion is that a lot of times even the organizations, and this may sound controversial, the organizations for Hindus in Trinidad purport that narrative that it is devoid of elements of the environment and it comes in a pure form or as manifested now.
Right.
You spoke of the 1940s and the 1950s as a key period because now we look at something not revolted against, burials, which was fine among the Hindu practice. It wasn't seen as outside their tradition.
But can I just add, those same ethnographic reports, both of them they explicitly report that the Hindus that they lived among and worked with and spoke to saw cremation as unpleasant or unthinkable, actually. So burial was not only just the norm, but actually they had an antipathy or an antagonism toward cremation. Oh, which is interesting, right? It shows that there's something had happened sort of at the popular level that had reversed some of the heritage, important aspects of the heritage coming from that would have been brought from South Asia in regard to cremation.
Right. Very interesting topic. We'll be back after the break.
We all want to save money without compromising on the best quality insurance coverage. If you are renewing your motor or homeowner insurances soon, then call us at Ekta Consultants. With over 27 years in the insurance industry, we can offer you significant savings on your insurance premiums. As agent for Guardian Group, we assure you the best quality coverage at a very competitive price. Email us at ektagroupmail@gmail.com.
Welcome back. We're here with Dr. Keith McNeal looking at the mortuary rituals or the Antihishti Sanskar of the Hindus, specifically within Trinidad, and basically what political, what historical, sociological, and anthropological factors would have impinged on burials being the norm to cremation now being the norm. A lot of points raised in your research and the data. Now, before we went to the break, you spoke of the fact that there was definitely a movement towards cremation during the 1940s and 50s. We'll look at that. But you also made the point that when that movement started, the Hindus themselves were uncomfortable with even going with cremations. They were comfortable with the norm at that time and the most popular way to bury. So tell us a little bit more. That's something very interesting.
Yeah, actually, this is one of the more interesting aspects of the research for me was that, you know, from the late 30s through the 40s until 1953, when the Cremation Act was passed and cremation was formally sanctioned by the colonial government at the time, you know, it actually was a really hard fought and, you know, won effort on the part of Hindu activists and spiritual leaders, not only here, but in conjunction and conversation with folks in Guyana, as well as India. That's an interesting part of the story too. But what I found was that, you know, cremation was legalized in 1953, but we have these other anthropological reports from the 50s that suggest that Hindus basically were not that interested in cremation and actively saw it as an unpleasant or something that they were not interested in doing at all. And we even have data all the way through the 70s. There was an Indian sociologist from India, J.C. Jha, who spent time at the University of the West Indies, and he specifically did research on the life cycle rites of passage for Hindus, the samskaras. And when he studied Antyasti Samskar in the mid-70s, he found that the majority of Hindus, up until that time as well, still considered cremation to be a sort of unpleasant thing. They looked kind of down upon it. They either saw it, and they would rationalize it as sort of like unsanitary or just kind of backward or not modern, something, you know, they weren't comfortable with the practice of cremation. But then by the 80s, things start turning around, and then it's the 80s, and then especially in the 90s that the pendulum swings from burial as the norm to cremation as the not only the norm but the standard practice. So much so now that we even have Christian Indians who are doing pyre-based cremation and adapting that and incorporating that as part of like a pyre-based Christian mortuary ritual.
But we'll look at that at the end. Off camera, we spoke of two defining moments regarding the rituals that would now help us understand a bit more about how it was accepted just to do.
Two incidents that I think are interesting in and of themselves, but they really punctuate the complexity of social change at various moments. One was 1940. Maybe some of your viewers would be familiar with the Kirpalanis. People may, you know, the Kirpalanis were two Sindhi brothers who came, Murli Dar and his brother. So Murli was the younger one, and he died in 1940, and he was from India. They were from India, and he wanted to be cremated, and his family wanted to cremate him. So they actually, through their lawyer, they approached Sir Hubert Young, the governor at the time, and asked for permission to cremate. And actually, permission was granted. So in one sense, that was a sort of accomplishment, right? Like someone actually pushed for and got permission from the government to cremate. But guess what the location was where they were granted to stage the cremation? The Labas, right? So here you have, it's a deeply ironic and paradoxical moment, right? Because on the one hand, a cremation is formally granted. It's an exceptional one. It's not legal at the time, but yet there is a cremation, but it's also like a slap in the face to the Hindu community, because it's like, what could be more offensive than saying, okay, you can do your religious rite, you know, your observance, but you're going to do it in the rubbish dump, you know?
But looking at that point, was it a political reason to choose there, or was it the fact that because cremations weren't popular, there weren't sites to cremate, and looking at fire safety, they looked at the lavas.
Yeah, but I mean, I can't say, right?
Right,
Because I
right,
don't
yeah,
know.
you would-
We
yeah,
don't
yeah.
have sources on
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Just the sources we have for this stuff is very limited and
Yeah,
partial,
sure,
right?
sure.
So there's only so much that one can say about it. But if the government really wanted to grant a proper cremation, the space and place for a proper cremation, surely there are other places in the island where,
Right,
you
right,
know, I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
where
yeah.
if they were concerned about sanitary condition, you know, like there are a whole host of problems and reasons that the colonial government cited all along for being opposed to cremation.
Right.
But they could have found other venues that it didn't have to be the lavas, right?
And there was another one we spoke of, a popular pundit.
Yeah, okay, so the other incident that I think that is really interesting is that in 1958, Dun Pandit died. Dun Pandit was perhaps the most important Hindu spiritual religious figure on the island at the time. There are many credits to his name. He was part of the Hindu school building movement. He actually started the leper colony down the islands. He was made a member of the British Empire. He was knighted by the Queen, and he was a very important figure. But for our purposes here, Dun Pandit, when he died in 1958, he was buried.
Right.
So think about that. Cremation was actually legalized in 1953, and 5 years later, the most, if not the most, you know, perhaps I would say probably the most important, but arguably one of the most important Hindu spiritual figures on the island was buried. That shows, I think, that that's an index of how, you know, standard burial was. And
right.
If cremation was, you know, they could have cremated him if they wanted to, you know.
Yeah.
But the fact that he wasn't, his tomb is in Las Lomas. It's actually, I have it documented in the chapter, and I'll be showing it in my talk at the Nagar. But there's a tomb. If you're heading south toward Las Lomas, there's a field at some point, and on the right there's like a concrete little crypt, a little tomb there, and that's Dun Pandit's tomb. I think most people don't know who he is, much less where he would be buried. But it is there, and I think it was refurbished in the 1990s, and it's there to this day.
Now, looking at the political forces, because we had a conversation off camera, and yes, certain forces politically, socially in Trinidad would have contributed to that 1940 to 1950 movement, but at that time, a very interesting thing was happening in India. They moved towards independence and separation. And I would assume that would have a lot to do with what the movement to try to push towards, or at least, and the same people of Indian origin who would have existed at that point. Now not even wanting to do it, but there was a drive. So how was that linked to the independence movement in India?
I mean, we can only speculate, I think.
Right,
I mean, I think there are connections. You know, when Gandhi died, he was assassinated, but when he died, he was cremated. It was a very high profile. It was covered in the media, and it would have been people all over the world, including in the Indian diaspora, would have, you know, had access to images of his cremation. So I think that probably that would have
been, yeah.
I mean, it's hard to say and pinpoint. You can't quantify it, but I think that probably would have been a really important kind of high profile cremation image that would have, you know, at least possibly, you know, entered the local, you know, consciousness, right? And maybe have contributed, like planted a seed that would eventually start pushing, you know, encouraging a shift toward cremation. I did want to say that based on my research, it seems like the first public legal cremation site was on the banks of the Karani, just south of El Socorro. And Sat Balkaran Singh told me that his father was cremated there in 1954. So that would have been 1 year after the Cremation Act of 1953. And that also means that Dun Pandit could have been cremated there, you know, in a couple of years later when he passed. And then I don't know how long that first site was going just south of El Socorro on the banks of the Karani. Then sometime later it was moved east just west of the Southern Highway, and then it was moved a third time to its current location east of the Southern Highway. The current.
Apart from the cremation of Mahatma Gandhi being something that was iconic, that would have changed the viewpoint or now changed the norm, or at least that seed planted to change the norm, what other religious, cultural, or political movements coming out of India would have now incited certain groups in Trinidad within the Hindu community to now even look or consider cremation to be an alternative?
Well, the sort of vanguard of leaders and politicians and religious folks and Hindu cultural and religious activists who really kind of raised the banner and were fighting for various Hindu rights from the late 30s through the 40s. Marriage, schooling, cremation, the list is a long one. They were essentially part of an evolving conversation that we now talk about as Sanatanism or Sanatan Dharma, right? And that's a very complicated story that is, beyond even my level of specialization. The origins of Sanatanism in South Asia as a sort of response to the encroachments of modernity and modernization and science and so on and so forth within the within the South Asian religious and cultural landscape. And Sanatanism was not only kind of emerging, organizing, and consolidating itself in South Asia, but actually had very integral links with folks throughout the diaspora, and actually a very significant part of the Sanatanist constituency were in fact diaspora folks. So, for example, there was a guy called Dr. Parashuram Sharma who was a Sanatanist leader there was a Guyanese pundit called Dinanath Tiwari who came to Trinidad in the 30s and 40s. He then went to India. He brought back Dr. Sharma, and then Sharma was actually they were going around together, sort of arguing with folks, politically and religiously about, the rights of Hindus. I did want to also mention that it's exactly the same time. I'm now thinking about 1953 and the legalization of cremation. That's the exact same time that the Shouter Baptist, the Spiritual Baptist Prohibition Ordinance was repealed in 1951, right? And then it was actually the exact same sitting, I have the Hansard here, is the exact same sitting of the third session of the 8th Legislative Council at that time. They granted the incorporation of the Spiritual Baptists, the first sort of incarnation of a Spiritual Baptist national organization. And it was very explicit. Even some of the Hindu activists and some of the politicians were saying, look, we're realizing that Spiritual Baptists have been treated the wrong way. So just like Spiritual Baptists, need to be treated appropriately and given their full religious and cultural rights, Hindus also need their cultural rights. So there's an interesting sort of concurrent, contemporary, parallel set of developments, and it very much is understood in terms of rights, cultural rights specifically.
So essentially, looking at it, it was really a religio-political or political-religious movement within that period now would have driven the consciousness now in a different direction. But also importantly, I think, and I don't know what your perspective is that seeing that independence was in the air and the colonies were dropping their overseas territories, it was very instrumental in shaping that cognizance, in the sense that grabbing onto something that was deviant from mainstream was seen as some sort of revolution. and aspiring towards identity and identifying yourself from the rest of what the hoi polloi would have been was also part of this conversation that was taking place. From your perspective.
What is the question?
So basically I was looking at, because you raised the point that it was not just the Hindus themselves asking for things or equity, it was also the Baptists as well. So it wasn't just, as we always look at the narrative, just from a Hindu perspective, but it was something that was nationwide. So even though you might say, yes, the cognizance was now going from burial to cremation, there were also other subtle changes within the norms of the practices in Trinidad and Tobago. What I also want to look at, so we're looking at after that 1950s period going up to the 1970s, you said that even then people would bury from the Hindu faith.
Right.
Based on your research now, what factors would have contributed to that propagation of still that being the norm? And it took some time, you said 1980s into the 1990s to now see cremation as the norm. Yeah.
I mean, that's the big question. I mean, as I did this research, that's the big question that opened up for me, because on the one hand, I see it as like a two-channel set of developments, right? Like at a sort of higher legal, political level, the fight to legalize and defend the right, the Hindu cultural rights as seen in the right to cremate, and the legalization of cremation is accomplished at a certain moment in time, mid-20th century, 1953, right? But yet, for more than 3 decades at the level of popular religious and ritual practice, in fact, it's more than 3 decades later before we even see the tides starting to shift, the pendulum swing from burial as the norm, as the standard, toward cremation, right? And it's by the late 80s that Kumar Mahabir, the local anthropologist, he wrote a paper on Hindu, something about funerary rites among Indians. And at that point he says, you know, cremation is the most common, it's the most standard. So like just more than a decade before, you have J.C. Jha reporting that Hindus still think that cremation is an unpleasant idea. But by the end of the 80s, clearly the tide has turned. And then by the 90s, cremation really becomes the standard fundamental practice, right? So the big question becomes why?
Right. And we'll look at that after the break, but I just want to just show you these books, Trance and Modernity in the Southern Caribbean. I think this book you had written in...
That came out in 2011.
And if anybody would be interested in getting a copy, it should be available online, Amazon?
It's available online, and also paper-based bookshop at the Normandy. They have a really great, they'll source these books for people too. And
this recent edition where you wrote a chapter, Passages and the Afterworlds, if you're interested in reading the chapter done by Dr. McNeal, this is what it looks like, and where would it be available?
Same bookstore. It's edited actually by 2 UE anthropologists, one here at UE St. Augustine and the other at UE Cave Hill. They're the ones who organized the symposium that led to the production of this volume.
All right, so we'll continue the discussion after the break.
MRK Consultants, agent for Presidential Insurance Company Limited, is celebrating 16 years of insurance services. With convenient parking and knowledgeable staff, MRK Consultants are geared to provide all your motor insurance needs, including third-party and comprehensive coverage for all your motor vehicles. Call or visit our office today. MRK Consultants, Chandrahari Building, number 9, Todd Street, El Socorro, 221-5051. Save on your motor insurances. Call MRK today.
And welcome back. So this evening is very interesting because we have looked at a lot of misconceptions within the history itself as recorded within the school system, and how we educate people about how the mortuary rituals of not only the Hindu community, but as we looked at other communities as well, would have also been influenced by what was taking place during that time. I just want to encourage you to go to Caribbean Hindustani. This is a broad conversation. We mightn't cover everything in the research. Caribbean Hindustani is on Facebook, also part of this program. You just go Caribbean Hindustani and search for Caribbean Hindustani on Facebook, and the page should come up. Now, I'm going to go back part of my history because you said the 1990s. And well, my story will be a bit anecdotal. I remember all my relatives being cremated, but my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, my nanny, was buried, which was strange for me because at that point, 1990s, cremation was seen to be the norm. Yeah. But then when I asked the story and the history behind it, her son, my uncle, died in his 20s. And at that time, the burial was more socially acceptable and the norm. And when he had died, she had bought the 2 plots and promised she would be buried next to him.
Interesting.
So that she had to go with that pact she made, I guess, with her son. So even things like that, I guess. Yeah. People who have relationships and memories from that period shortly after the 1950s would now go into still having burial because of that tradition. Now we come into the 1990s and we come into cremation. Being more socially acceptable, but it's socially acceptable not only in the East Indian community, people of Indian origin and Hindus, but also in the Christian realm and the Christian sects. Right. Christianity, as we know from an Abrahamic tradition, usually believe in burial because of the idea of resurrection and judgment. Correct. But now in a Trinidad practice, we see a lot of the sects, especially the Presbyterians, because they hold on to the identity of as people of Eastern origin despite being converted, having these cremations, and not cremations as we are accustomed to in the pious style as Hindus, but now even Hindus start using the crematorium. So based on your research, bringing that into conversation now, what would you have found?
Well, I mean, so now you even have some people performing Antyashti, parts of the Antyashti Samskar in funeral homes. Yeah. Right? Using the industrial or mechanical crematorium, right? So I think there are interesting ritual developments in a number of directions, right? You have Antyashti Samskar being adapted to off the pyre, using cremation in a mechanical industrial crematorium, right? We have these hybrid sort of we have the adaptation of pyre-based cremation for Christian Indian funerals and mortuary ritual practice. And then we also have the development of sort of like Hindu-Christian forms of hybrid mortuary ritual, in between as well. So we have sort of different sort of micro-traditions, maybe we could say, evolving in different directions because of the complexity of social change and various kinds of influences. And also, we grow up in these personal networks. So like in the case of your grandmother, there's a connection there, there's a relationship there, so there's a time-release dimension to her own burial. So even though the pendulum had swung toward cremation, she's burying in that instance.
And even I noticed that some Hindus still bury. And it's seen, and the Antyashti Samskar has been adapted to, as you said, in the 5 forms. But we have definitely looked at politics being very influential in these norms and forgotten traditions, the topic or the focus of this program. So I want to bring in Dr. Eric Williams at this point, and his Antyashti Samskar that was also influential, or it also represented the sort of pendulum switch over to cremation?
Yeah, as I was saying, in between, off camera, in between the segments, another kind of local important influence, we talked about the Gandhi's high-profile cremation in 1947 and the possible influence of that. But locally, Eric Williams dies in 1981 and he was cremated. It was a high-profile cremation for the local population. They brought in, Erica Williams told me that they had to bring in special, equipment to cremate the body, and then that equipment was kept. And then from that point onward, cremation through, industrial mechanical crematoria begins to spread in the 80s in Trinidad, and so there's also that's another that's another development of the cremating plot line outside the Hindu piece of the puzzle, right? There's no way, we can't exactly measure it or quantify it, but I've often wondered, like, did that also, how much did Eric Williams' cremation, or how much did the proliferation and expansion of industrial cremation factor into, I think it's plausible to think that would have, even if it was a secondary influence, it would have helped normalize cremation more generally, right? It's just that as it became more acceptable for Christians and Hindus, right, then you could choose as a Hindu, okay, I'm going to do it on a pyre, as opposed to non-Hindus, as opposed to Christians choosing to do it in a crematorium.
And then there was another political figure where it went from the political to different sects of religion, which would have formed its roots. You mentioned that off camera, and I think that's the quintessential where we're at this point, irrespective of your political alignment, irrespective of your religious alignment, and irrespective of which ethnic group or culture you come from.
You're talking about the Ramnath funeral.
Yes.
No, I was mentioning that I start my chapter in this volume. I actually start with the anecdote of, Kelvin Ramnath, former UNC MP, Kuva South. He died in 2012, and I start with an anecdote of his funeral because it encapsulates sort of like the present moment in such a concrete, palpable way, but it's totally unthinkable even just 2 decades before, right? Because you have Ramnath, who is Presbyterian. At his funeral, the coffin is processed to his former constituency office in Kuva South, right? So there's a political dimension, right? Then it's taken to the Arunodai Presbyterian Church in Balmain, Kuva. The funeral happens. Pandy's there. There's some couture that happens, but that's another story, right? Because it's the politics of the UNC at that point. Leaving that aside, and then his coffin is taken to the cremation site in Waterloo, next to the Temple by the Sea, where he was cremated in a closed coffin. So there's obvious differences in terms of the mortuary ritual practices of Christian Indians versus Hindu Indians. Hindus cremate with an open coffin, Christians cremate with a closed coffin, but nonetheless, Ramnath was cremated at Waterloo on what was actually a Hindu originally a Hindu cremation site, in a set of rites that have been adapted for incorporating a Hindu ritual practice into a Christian funerary and newly evolving Christian, Indo-Caribbean Christian funerary tradition.
Right, and that brings to the point, because we spoke of, burials still done within Hindu communities in Trinidad, but now the majority, virtually all the Presbyterians actually come from people of Indian origin. And would you then say that the Presbyterians now embracing cremation was also part of that moving pendulum, but also now cremation, as you said in the chapter, that it was also a sense of identity?
Absolutely, yeah. I use the language of ethnicization, and I talk about how Hinduism has in a sense been ethnicized. So it's not only like Hinduism is not only embraced and a source of pride for Hindus, right? But Christian Indians also, Hinduism is a source of pride. It's a source of cultural assertion. It's a sense of heritage, right? So cremation, in a similar way, has become like ethnicized. It's no longer the Hindu way. It's become the Indian way.
Right.
In a really important sense. So that in that regard, it's connected to identity, and specifically, I would say the politics of identity in Trinidad and Tobago in the post-colonial period, right? Because it's not something that is transpiring and unfolding the same way everywhere in the Indian diaspora, among Hindus in the diaspora everywhere.
Now, just looking at possibility, because we, on the last points of this, possibilities of expanding this research, because I must say this is a very commendable piece of research. It has undone a lot of misconceptions in the past. It has now shaped the idea of how history would have evolved separate from what the mainstream narrative is. Look, because your research was truly based in the Southern Caribbean. You would have visited Guyana and Suriname as well, which also have a substantial community of people of Indian origin. I doubt you would have started this research there, but based on a prima facie context on your interactions there, how much do you think then this same association in the variables would now even be in Guyana and Suriname?
It's a great question. I've visited both Guyana and Suriname several times each, and I have I've made my way through cemeteries and cremation sites in both countries, but I haven't done any in-depth research whatsoever. So I can't really say. I would expect. Even going back into the 30s, there was a lot of interchange and linkages between, especially Guyana and Trinidad, but also Suriname, the development of sort of Hindu organizing and these evolving Sanatanist organizations. So, there is like colonial cross currents that are shaping how things are unfolding all the way back into that time, right? So I would expect the story to be somewhat similar, but I would also not be surprised if in fact there are kind of, specific differences or, secondary changes or plot lines that emerge in Guyana and or Suriname that are, maybe somewhat similar but also different. And we need research. I actually feel like there's so much more. What I've done is a lot, but actually I've done enough to realize how much more research there is to do, even just in Trinidad. So I would be very interested in deepening that research. I think I've opened the door for other people to follow and also pursue to do some of that research. But expanding and doing comparative inquiry in Suriname and Guyana, I think would be very productive and help us get a better sense, clearer about what's similar and what's different about the experiences in these, geographically close yet, different territories, populations. And I do want to take the opportunity that if anyone who's listening to the show, at this point, I've developed a schematic analysis that I think is relatively, on point. But it's, covering 150 years, and I'm very interested in hearing from people talking about, giving me anecdotes, talking about how they always heard about their ancestors doing things, what happened with their grandparents, I'd love to hear stories that both corroborate and challenge my analysis, because it's a big topic, it's a long period of time, and at this point I need more data and I need more anecdotes and material to continue deepening and, nuancing my perspective.
If anybody wants to get in contact with you, you want to just say, if there's a phone contact, email, so that at least they could reach you so that you could expand the research?
I guess so. Can they? Yeah, I guess I could give my email address. How would I do that?
You could just call it out and
Keith, Keith, dot McNeal, MCNEAL, at gmail.com.
Right.
Keith.e.mcneal at gmail.com.
Right, and I also want to tell viewers that Keith is also a member of Caribbean Hindustani, the group page.
Yeah, that's another.
So that's another way you could reach him. Once you go to the group, you could put a post and just tag him on it and ask him the question or want to get in contact with him as well.
That's great.
Caribbean Hindustani has always supported the research you have done because it's about identity, and this is looking at this is a great deal of discovering who we are.
The group would also be a forum for other people to comment on these anecdotes and the material that people are offering.
Sure, and then the group is international too. It's not only
Yeah,
Trinidad,
right.
it'll be all over the diaspora. Because I think even if we carry this research into Fiji, South Africa, and Mauritius, even Belize and Jamaica, a lot of would be uncovered. Because as we see, when the narrative seems to only focus on Trinidad, there's a lot of factors internationally that also influences that consciousness of who we are. One more thing I want to look at, as I think is very important. We talked about Sanatanists and the drive towards that during the independence and partition period in India. But one other important movement was the Arya Samaj. The Arya Pratinidhi Sabha is the official body in Trinidad, and I understand that it essentially started off in in Guyana, and then started coming into Trinidad. Based on the Arya Samaj perspective and cremation, what role that had to play now in switching of that pendulum?
I mean, I'm not an expert about Arya Samaj, but my general understanding is that, you know, they kind of represented the so-called modernizing, sort of progressive form of a kind of neo-Hindu
a Renaissance
tradition.
period.
And so that there was a critique that the Arya Samajas were sort of offering and lodging against certain kinds of practices, right? Caste, women, murtis, or whatever. And so I would imagine that, I mean, part of the development and the developing momentum of Sanatanism was in response to the critique represented by Arya Samajas, right? And again, this is a trans-colonial thing. This is a discussion and a debate that's unfolding in India and throughout the diaspora. I don't know. Most of what I know in terms of Arya Samaj activity in the Caribbean, I don't actually recall discussion. I'm sure there was discussion and debate about mortuary ritual practice and cremation, but I don't know definitively what their position on court's disposal was. But it's a great question that
they looked into. But thank you, Keith, for coming to Bhoolal Parampara Forgotten Traditions. I think we explored a lot of forgotten traditions, especially from a political and anthropological and sociological perspective. Now, you will be doing a talk at the library in at the National Council of Indian Culture, where NCIC Nagar Avenue at Diwali Nagar. Unfortunately, this episode will air after that, but hopefully we could get a recording of it.
I hope
and,
so.
I could probably have it on Caribbean Hindustani.
Great.
And hopefully snippets of this interview could also go out.
Yeah, I'm going to kind of do a much more systematic presentation of my research and use a lot of images and sort of systematically reconstruct the history that I've sort of alluded to. We've been skipping around.
So the bits and pieces we have forgotten now because we highlighted most of the important bits of the research. So thank you again, viewers, for looking at our program tonight, Bhoolal Parampara. Again, you could reach Neil via Facebook. He gave his email address, and also Caribbean Hindustani, a big part of this program in Forgotten Traditions. I would like to tell you Sitaram, Namaste, Assalamu Alaikum, and good night.